then. So good afternoon. My name is Courtney Doggart. I am the president of Network 2020. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that is dedicated to creating more informed conversations around global affairs. And so today is a slightly different topic in that we're actually looking in our own backyard right now. Network 2020 is based in New York, and we're delighted that we have Commissioner Carmelyn Malalis to join us today in conversation with Dr. Helena Kane Finn. So Commissioner Malalis was appointed Chair and Commissioner of the New York City Commission on Human Rights, the city agency that is tasked with combating discrimination in New York City by Mayor Bill de Blasio. And she is doing this after following more than a decade in private practice as an advocate for employees' rights in the workplace. Prior to her appointment, Commissioner Malalis was a partner at Uten & Golden LLP, where she co-founded and co-chaired its lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender workplace rights practice group. She is currently a member of the New York City Bar Association's Executive Committee and previously served on Human Rights Watch's Advisory Committee of the LGBT Rights Project, the American Bar Association Section on Labor and Employment Law Committee on Diversity in the Legal Profession, the New York City Bar's Committee on LGBT Rights, and the Board of Queers for Economic Justice. And we also have Dr. Helena Kane Finn, who will be leading the conversation today. And she is the main New York representative for the International Federation of Business and Professional Women at the United Nations. She has been a visiting scholar at Columbia University and served as the Vice President and Director of Programs at the American Council on Germany in New York. She also has a 3-decade career as a diplomat at the U.S. Department of State, where she focused on public diplomacy. She has also been the Cyrus Vance Fellow in Diplomatic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and also director of the Turkish Studies program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm going to stop there because I think we want to hear from everyone. So with that, I will turn it over to Helena to lead the conversation.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Courtney. And yes, I can't help joking. I must be 150 years old to have been all those places and done those things. Anyway, we are so pleased to have Carmelyn Malalis, Commissioner Malalis, with us today to talk about, one of the most important topics we could possibly bring to discussion with this group, and that is human rights. So I'd like to, I think everybody's familiar with the 1945 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we may not be so familiar with the New York City Commission. And that's what I would like to ask her about, and also about New York City human rights law, but how does this all fit into a global context? So.
Great, thanks so much, Helena. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Network 2020, of course to Courtney and to Dr. Finn for inviting me and including the New York City Commission on Human Rights in this program. I think we're living in times where it's so important for us to see how things, how things connect domestically and internationally. And we're seeing a lot of things that I think we, from here in New York City and from the United States, we've addressed historically, internationally, now playing out domestically. And so certainly I hope that there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and the people who are in positions to be making decisions, including myself, are listening to that. So thank you so much for including us in this discussion. With that, for folks who are not familiar, so the New York City Commission on Human Rights, we are the city agency that enforces all of New York City's anti-discrimination and anti-harassment protections. Anywhere you live, breathe, work, exist in New York City, you are protected by our law. You need not live here. If you're stepping foot in New York City for that time period, you are protected by our law. And our human rights law, for many reasons, is considered to be one of the most robust, both nationally and internationally. One of the reasons for that is just the sheer number of protections that we have under our law. We have 26 categories of protection. And as you can well imagine, given the, given the people who are, interested in being active politically and in human rights related issues in New York City, the categories of protection continue to expand year after year. Our categories of protection are applicable in employment, in housing, in places of public accommodation. They're also applicable in kind of interesting areas of applicability that you don't see in other spaces. So for instance, we have something that is called discriminatory harassment, which is a civil form of hate crime. And we also have something called bias-based profiling by law enforcement. So to the extent to which somebody who fits into one of our categories of protection is being profiled by NYPD because of their membership in that category, they can also file claims at the Commission on Human Rights. And the way that our human rights law is written, it's actually drafted in a way that people are forced to look at protections under our city human rights law as being more protective than what you would find under similar applicable civil rights laws on the federal level or on the state level. And there have been several amendments to our law to make it very clear to people who are interpreting and using our law that, you know, federal and state protections, even though they read very similarly, should be looked at as a floor, not as a ceiling, as to where people can find a remedy in our space. I also, you know, I love mentioning that our commission, our agency, it's really formulated as a true human rights agency. There is this very large civil law enforcement piece, so people can file claims and, you know, initiate complaints under our law that we investigate. We also have the ability to initiate investigations affirmatively on behalf of the City of New York, where we see that there are perhaps vulnerable populations that don't want to put their names forward on a complaint, perhaps because of prior engagement with criminal legal enforcement, perhaps because of the prior history of surveillance or prior history of policing in their neighborhoods. And so we, because it is to the benefit of the city to address all forms of discrimination, we can affirmatively address those types of situations. But in addition to the civil law enforcement component that we have, that I think typically people think of as civil rights, we also have this affirmative, this kind of positive rights related area of our agency, a community relations bureau, and they are really ensconced within community in each of the 5 boroughs. And we have a mandate under our law too, that they are every day interacting with different constituencies, different groups within New York City to make sure they are aware of their rights, to help communities sometimes address intergroup conflict as they may arise because our city is so diverse. And then also address other issues that fit within the ethos of human rights, whether that is the ethos of human rights here locally under our law or the ethos of human rights internationally and some of the things that we would find under some of the international instruments. So I like to think that we're looking at human rights within New York City in a very holistic way.
Thank you. It's a real sense of the scope of the work you're doing. It's really very impressive. Since we're living through this terrible global pandemic, you know, I've seen a couple of reports, both in papers and also TV broadcasts, of harassment of Asian Americans and indeed other Asians who live here. And I'm wondering what the situation is in New York City, and what, if anything, are you doing about discrimination against Asians?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for that question. You know, I think unfortunately for folks who are involved in human rights, we see that it's almost like clockwork, right? When there is a time of global crisis, when there's a time of pandemic, immediately there are forces that look to groups to scapegoat or to stigmatize in these instances. And we've seen this, I think, over and over again with different types of health-related crises or with different types of health-related, you know, panics. Certainly with HIV/AIDS, we've seen that happen with LGBTQIA communities. We've seen it also when there was an Ebola outbreak, and we saw how Black communities, especially communities from the African diaspora, how they were also stigmatized and affected in that time. And here, you know, unfortunately, because we are getting what I think of as anti-Asian racist rhetoric from the federal government in this space, there has been a significant increase in reports to our agency of anti-Asian racism. And you know, we collect these complaints both for purposes of law enforcement actions or complaints that may be investigated, but also in terms of how do we address these issues, or how do we address incidents as they occur in community. Just to give folks a sense of, you know, when I say an uptick or an increase, just to give you a sense of what I mean by that. If you look at the time period just from, you know, a 3-month period from February to May of this year of 2020, we registered almost 150 complaints of anti-Asian discrimination or harassment. Looking at the same time period just last year in 2019, there were only 12. So you see that, you know, certainly there's been an increase, and it's been something that my agency, even before we went into a shelter-in-place situation in New York City, that we were already trying to address. You know, we had seen early on that people were stigmatizing a lot of our Asian communities by not going to, you know, the different Asian community business districts or Chinatowns, whether it was here in the Manhattan's Chinatown or in Flushing or in Sunset Park. We saw ways in which people were being stigmatized or harassed, sometimes violently on the street, whether it was in train stations or in other transit-related areas. And then when we entered a shelter-in-place environment, we saw that somewhat change as, you know, the interaction between people was changing, right? Things were more kind of internal, closer to home. And so we saw more, we received more calls regarding discrimination or harassment that people were experiencing in their housing situations. There were situations where, you know, landlords would try to refuse entry to the home units of people of Asian descent, fearing that they were more likely to have COVID. Similarly, we saw with some places of public accommodation that we saw, you know, whether it was, you know, retail stores or bodegas also trying to keep out people of Asian descent or making comments to people of Asian descent similar for that. So we also very early on created a COVID-19 response unit working across our agency. So the issues that we could be addressing through a law enforcement posture, we would be doing that. But also for people who had immediate needs, like when I was talking about housing situations, you can't wait for litigation in order to be able to enter your home, right? And you shouldn't be waiting for litigation in order to be able to enter your neighborhood bodega, especially at the time of COVID, when, as everybody sadly remembers, here in New York City, it was also a time where, you know, getting groceries, getting basic amenities was very challenging. People really relied on their neighborhood stores. So in those situations, rather than going through a litigation process, we basically put out information or education, or reached out from the agency from an educational perspective to educate housing providers or employers of public accommodations, to let them know what the law is, and they had to cease and desist that type of behavior. And in many of the situations, we were able to rectify and remedy the situation without having to go into litigation. We also have done several types of trainings and workshops to help people in community. I think, you know, one of the reasons that I love raising my family in New York City is that I think that we are living in a city where generally people welcome diversity, they welcome inclusion, they want to be there for their neighbor, they want to keep our spaces inclusive. And so many people would be around situations or observing situations and thinking to themselves, what should I do? What should I do in a situation where I'm seeing that somebody is being harassed? What should I do in a situation where I see that somebody is being discriminated against? So then we also increased our bystander intervention trainings to help people feel more comfortable, more armed, more part of the solution of affirmatively being able to address harassment or discrimination when they see it arise in their communities, and to do so in a safe way. So that's just a sampling of some of the things that we've been doing, you know, as we've seen this unfortunate increase in discrimination and harassment against Asian Americans in our communities.
This is fantastic. It should be a model, of course, for the entire country. These measures that you've taken here. I was interested to see, before I move on to the next question, I was interested to see that ironically, in the Chinese neighborhood in San Francisco, which is a very large Asian community, that actually there was a very low incidence of the virus. People knew what to do. They took action immediately. So this whole idea that just because someone comes from an Asian background, they're going to be transmitting the virus was absolutely absurd.
Well, certainly, and on the messaging on that, one of the things that we also launched a COVID-19 discrimination harassment related campaign. One, letting people know how to report instances of discrimination or harassment with our team, but also just putting out the message there that, we all have the power to control this type of harassment. We do. Don't do it. Don't feed into the stereotypes. Don't feed into the stigma. When you hear about it, educate people. Let them know that this is not supported by science. It's not supported by the metrics that we've seen here in New York City, and it's certainly not supported by the metrics we've seen nationally, as you were saying, in other cities. I think the other thing, to your point, Helena, looking at specific communities, that's been very important about our outreach, is we've also increased our offerings in different languages. So at the Commission on Human Rights, making sure that our team is representative of the city in which we're situated is incredibly important to me. My parents are immigrants from the Philippines. I know very well, from a very personal perspective, the types of discrimination and harassment that immigrant communities experience. And I also very much understand the barriers to reporting these types of issues. It's very personal. People feel very vulnerable. What is going to help people report these types of very personal, very vulnerable type incidents? It's having some familiarity with people that they're speaking to, especially if those people are in government, right? Which itself kind of intrinsically has its own barriers for a lot of communities. So our staff, when I first got to the commission, we had a staff that spoke about 9 languages. Our staff now speak over 30 languages. And it's really helped us, in these sort of situations. So we're able to do bystander intervention trainings in Korean and Mandarin and Fujianese and Tagalog. We're able to do, know your rights trainings in similar languages. If you are the victim of discrimination or harassment, the last thing you need to do is figure out, how do I actually express that? How do I actually express the indignity in another language if that's not what I'm most comfortable in? And so we're trying to really decrease some of those reporting barriers.
That's very impressive. Yeah, I'm just thinking of that neighborhood in Queens where there is something like 150 different languages spoken in the schools. Exactly. So this is a New York solution to a New York situation. And of course, having this diversity in our city is our greatest blessing, really. So since, we're in the midst of COVID-19 and we're in the midst also of the Black Lives Matter movement and the reaction, of course, to the killing of George Floyd. But of course, this all goes much, much deeper into our history. And I wanted to ask you what you're doing about discrimination against Blacks in New York.
Sure. So, sadly, and of course, anti-Black racism is not a new topic. It's not a new phenomenon. It's existed for way too long. It continues to exist. It exists institutionally and structurally. That's why, for instance, Breonna Taylor, there still has not been justice in her case, in her situation. No one's been held to account there. And so it has similarly been a focus of the Commission on Human Rights for the past few years. Our agency is a smaller agency in New York City. We typically focus on issues that have, real relevance to particularly vulnerable communities in New York City, or spaces where we do not feel that there has been enough attention or enough enforcement action actually brought in those situations, but also in situations where we know that we can be a national voice. We can say, if New York City is doing it here, given all the challenges that are present in New York City, we have to be doing these things similarly in other jurisdictions or across the country. And really taking on and addressing the ways in which anti-Black racism is actually normalized in many institutions, is something that has been incredibly important to me personally, but also important for our agency in the last few years. So last year in February of 2019, we became the first jurisdiction to actually say that bans on natural Black hair or hairstyles typically worn by people of African descent, that was race discrimination under our law. And although that sounds crazy that we would have to actually say it, my background is as an employment lawyer, and I'll tell you that there has been a long history of federal courts and other courts basically putting themselves into pretzels to try to say that it's not race discrimination, that these are neutral policies, and that calling someone out for wearing locks or braids or bantu knots, that's not discrimination. When of course the experience of many Black people is, of course it is discrimination, and this is how it's affecting me, and this is how it's affecting me in my school or in my employment or in my community. So that was one thing that we did there. We followed it up to by making sure that we had a campaign that we put out in subway stations, in transit stations, digitally, etc., that we call the Wild Black campaign. And I'm hoping that some of the folks, at least folks who are here in New York City, saw that. But it was another way of calling out normalized forms of anti-Black racism that people experience just when they are existing in the world. So we had scenarios covered of people walking while Black, working while Black, shopping while Black, driving while Black, situations that we see now in the media, unfortunately today, where people are in parks, in playgrounds, sitting in front of their homes, and people try to weaponize the police, call them on people just because they are existing and being Black. Another normalized form of anti-Black racism that has to end. It must stop. And we have made a stand, basically, saying that we're not going to allow this. This is something that New York City recognizes happens, and we want to call out. Similarly, we also, we were very fortunate that we were able to have in residence with us an artist in residence who spent about 18 months with us, really focusing on the intersection of anti-Black racism and misogyny. Her name's Tatiana Fazlali-Zadeh. Some folks might be aware of some of her murals and some of her art that she's done internationally. She's very known for her Telling Women to Smile series of murals people may have seen. So she was our artist in residence, and we worked with her also because we wanted to really get at the intersection of how especially Black women and Black girls experience racism in their communities. But fast forwarding all of that to where we are now and what we're seeing here today, I think it's important for me to lay out some of that background, because I think it's very important as we think about how government addresses anti-Black racism in the future. One, that we think about the ways in which we have to create credibility with governments for working with Black communities, because it's been so much the history of many Black communities in many of our cities where when they are in relationship with government, that relationship is one of oppression, and it's one where people experience fear and they experience loss of liberty. So in order, I think, to be able to do positive things to address anti-Black racism, government really has to be in a space where it's actually proving to these communities that it actually exists for them too, that the rules apply to their benefit as well, and that government is there to make sure that their civil rights, their rights and rights to respect and liberty are also being addressed. And certainly, one of the things that I've been very humbled with and very privileged at the same time is to be working with a lot of organizations that have been doing this on the community level. Of course, me as I'm not a Black woman. I've not, have 3/4 of my family are Black. My wife is an immigrant from Ethiopia, and we are raising 2 Black girls. But certainly, I constantly have to be educated on this as well by people who have been doing this for years in their communities and on the ground. So we've been very close to those communities, and because of that, just this, maybe about a month ago, in the midst of what we've been seeing as the uprisings, across the city, we released a report on Black people's experiences with anti-Black racism across New York City, including their experiences with anti-Black racism from other city agencies or from other agencies across the city. Because I think if we're really going to get at anti-Black racism, we must talk about what's the culpability of government and what's the culpability of the state in those situations. And we wanted to make sure that we were being transparent about that as well.
Thank you. So, yes, I think the Black Lives Matter movement has brought home to us the extent of this history of discrimination. And just one little example, I've seen interviews on television of African Americans whose jobs were in jeopardy, who actually lost their jobs because of the way their hair appeared. And this is, I'm so glad you're confronting that along with so many other issues. It was just shocking to me that this could be a consideration in firing someone from a job, and how awful for people in our society to have to even think about something like that.
You know, at the time that we released it, you know, when we were gearing it up for its release, it was interesting. There were some people who said to me, really, hair? You're focusing on hair? You know, why is this a big deal? And then there were some people who said, oh my God, you're finally focusing on hair. Thank God someone's finally addressing this. And I remember doing an interview, I think it was an interview with Al Jazeera about it. Mm-hmm. And they said that they were leaving my office. This is, of course, before COVID set in. They were leaving my office to go to a barbershop to speak with people about their experiences with harassment or discrimination in this area. I said, if you want to speak to Black people about their experiences of discrimination or harassment, you don't even have to go to a barbershop. Leave my office, go down the street and ask people, because it's so prevalent. Because the way that people have had to self-police themselves at schools or in or workplaces is, you know, it's been so normalized to accept that this has to be done, or that employers have to do this. That's why we focused on it, because it was an everyday form. It was so prevalent, and it's just time for that to end.
I also like it because it's something that everyone can understand. And sometimes when you want to change people's hearts and minds, you really have to have an issue that's very basic and obvious and really brings the whole larger question home to people. Anyway, we do want to move on in a few minutes to questions, but I do want to ask you, since we're living in a global pandemic, and we're living in, a global reality. New York is a model, as far as I can see from what you've told us about human rights law here. How can this be applied to say, marginalized communities in other large cities, especially large diverse cities around the world? But even having said that, having lived in various places abroad, I would say there are cities where you have what on the surface appears to be a homogeneous population, Karachi, Pakistan, for example. But in fact, there can still be within that context all kinds of discrimination. So are there ways in which New York City can be a model?
Well, I think that there are. The thing that really comes to mind for me when you were saying that is that, you know, recently, we had a slate of, I think 3 very good decisions coming out of our Supreme Court, which was followed by some decisions that were not so fantastic. But, you know, one of what I consider to be a very good decision was the Bostock decision, where the Supreme Court for the first time addressed the issue of whether or not people could be fired for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And, I had the privilege of going to the oral argument at the Supreme Court for that case, and being an employment lawyer by background, you know, it's been something that I've been following very closely and have, in fact, been very involved in for a very long time. And some of the questions and some of the before the actual decision came out, you know, there was a line of questioning that people were very concerned about that took place at the oral argument, where the questions were about, you know, isn't there going to be like social upheaval? How will people react to this? Aren't we upending all the systems if we're suddenly saying that transgender people should be protected by anti-discrimination protections, things of that nature? And you know, something that I think was very important in this situation was to see that whenever there is a challenge to human rights, one of the areas, the lines of opposition is always, this is too fast, too much, it's going to be too hard for people to adjust to. But when you see that is, you know, that is underlined by the situations in places in large cities like New York City, where there hasn't been great social upheaval, where we're not seeing, you know, reports of safety being compromised because of crazy fear-mongered theories of safety issues, when you're not seeing that businesses have been upended and they're not going out of business because of this. I think that we exist as an important example of it can be done. It is impossible. Many of the issues that we work on now, many of the issues that we try to put out there, the hair discrimination is a great example of this. They rely on stereotype. They rely on people thinking a very certain way about what safety is. Safety is always used to curtail human rights, right? They think safety is an issue, so people can't have this hairstyle. Safety is an issue, so transgender people can't be at the workplace. If you see that it exists in other spaces, number one, as large as, but two, as diverse as a place like New York City, it really cuts the legs under those arguments. You cannot say that's the case when we have had protections against discrimination based on transgender people or transgender status since 2002. There's been no surge in safety issues reporting to the police or other issues. There's been no, so businesses have not had to close because of that. Similarly, with other areas of the law, when we are able to say in New York City, we are doing it, it has happened, it has been the case now for whether it is a decade or it is for 5 years, we are able to make that case for advocates, whether it is nationally or internationally, that your fears are not warranted. Many of the times they are based on outdated notions about race or gender or sexuality. And that's exactly what they are. They are outdated. You know, some of the things that I think that we're seeing in law, whether it's happening at the U.S. Supreme Court or that we see happening internationally, there's a way in which laws have not kept up with the lived experiences of the people that we're actually talking about. You know, it's not new phenomenon anymore. You can't talk about transgender people. You can't talk about women in the workplace. You can't talk about many of these things as new phenomenon anymore. They're not. So the law must, the human rights protections must match the lived experiences now of these communities.
That is,
New York City provides an example for that.
that is a wonderful point. That is a wonderful point, having the law catch up with reality. Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. Since we know that you're on a tight schedule, I want to move on now to questions. I have one question that came in advance, and then I believe that from the Network 2020 team, Brian is going to open up the chat. And let me just warn everyone, because of my location, sometimes I have a disconnection. If that happens, Courtney is there. She'll just take over for a second until I get back on. But this is a question that came in from Ali Aoun. And he says, is there a plan to focus on economic rights of various neighborhoods in New York to help addressing issues of inequality, perhaps new industry, more innovation, executing antitrust laws to tackle companies like, and he mentioned some specific companies. He mentions Con Ed, Whole Foods, and Spectrum. But what is your view on that?
So I think there are things that are located within our law, and so our law typically focuses head on issues of discrimination and harassment, right? And then there's other city agencies that may be involved in some of the other issues that take on more of those, social or economic type issues that were described in your question. For instance, our There's a city agency on housing preservation and development. There's one that deals with small business services. There's one that's very focused on looking at businesses owned by minority and business business entrepreneurs of color. For our agency, I'll say that one of the areas we have a few areas of our law that are considered fairly unique, in that most other jurisdictions do not have these same protections. One of them that comes to mind that we've really been aggressive on in the past few years that I've been here is included in our law protections against discrimination based on source of income. So that makes it such that people cannot be discriminated against in housing if they are paying for housing with some form of voucher or some form of public assistance. It is unfortunately a very common form of discrimination that we see here in New York City. That's also seen in other cities across the country. And it makes no sense, because landlords are getting paid. They're getting paid just as they would if they were being paid based out of somebody's income, but they're being paid here by oftentimes a government voucher. And so, especially as we're seeing people having grave challenges in housing, we want to make sure that if people are able to find housing and they're able to pay for them with these vouchers, that this, which is a form of economic discrimination, that they are not being discriminated against just because they're paying for it in this form. Another way that we have sought to deal with economic issues and find justice under our law is pretty early on. I want to say it was perhaps the first amendment to our law when I became chair and commissioner at our agency, is we made it illegal for employers to ask about any form of credit, their credit, before offering them employment. It basically is illegal to ask about someone's credit history or to use that as a way of determining if somebody's trustworthy or if somebody should be a good employee. Why? Because again, the science does not support it. Research does not support it. Somebody, years back, decades back, made a great decision of doing this, creating the perception that that is the case. But that is one of the situations where perception is not reality. So we also made that illegal under our law. So there's different ways that I kind of think of our proxy issues. That we're able to see that this is a form of economic discrimination. It often means that it's a proxy form of discrimination for communities of color, oftentimes for women or for people who are victims of domestic violence. And so from our perspective, if there are ways that we can get at those economic issues through a discrimination and harassment lens, that is what we try to do, because that's basically the mandate that we have under our law.
Okay, thank you. Let's go now to the first question on chat. And will you make that available to us, please?
Yes, yeah, here I can jump in. So the first question is from Shantanu Roy. And the question is, what are your thoughts and reactions to the Trump administration's decision to deploy federal troops to limit citizens' ability to exercise First Amendment rights and terrorize them amidst the COVID-19 pandemic? If the United States can't assure human rights to its citizens, then what right does the country have in penalizing other nations for violating human rights? Should not the United States lead by example? So a bit afield, but quite related. So, curious to hear your take on it from a human rights perspective from your seat in New York.
Sure. I mean, so one, the First Amendment is like the bedrock of which many human rights are founded, right? The First Amendment is incredibly important, and if people are unable to express their First Amendment rights, especially like as we're seeing, across the country in protest actions, that will have, I think, grave impact on human rights. And so just from a kind of very basic perspective, there's that. We also, one of the things that we deal with in our space though is, First Amendment rights are also not absolute in situations. And there are ways in which under our laws, First Amendment, under our laws, meaning even looking at this constitutionally, there are backstops to First Amendment when people's human rights are at stake, right? So you can't sexually harass somebody in the workplace and say First Amendment, right? Because we have decided as a society that is a limitation on First Amendment. You cannot do that because in order to address the public policy of providing safe, equitable workplaces, you cannot do that. So when we are, the ways in which that we look at human rights and First Amendment rights together is to think through the ways in which that one, we always as an agency, from what we are doing, we always want to make sure that we are respecting that bedrock principle, but also taking into consideration the ways in which other human rights then may get affected if people think that those rights are absolute. So that was not quite the answer to the question that was asked, but I was trying to answer it in the context of the work that we do at our agency.
So thank you. So that was the first question from chat. And now I have a question here that came in on the Q&A from Shantanu Roy.
That one's the one that I just asked, so you can move to the next one. Yes.
On the Q&A, that wasn't, okay. So let's go to, then why don't you pick up the next one, Courtney?
So the next one is from Natalie Mace, and she thanks both of you for your insights and said that she read on the NYC Commission on Human Rights on the website that the Commission on Human Rights considers a COVID-19 infection a disability under human rights laws. What is the reasoning behind this classification, and how does this designation protect New Yorkers?
So our law is considered, as I was saying earlier, our law is considered a lot more broad than federal law or state law. So what's been interesting with the onset of COVID-19, the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the federal agency that enforces many of the federal anti-discrimination protections in the workplace, they have been very active providing guidance on how employers and employees should be thinking about changes to our current work situation, and some of the ways in which, if we were not in a pandemic related situation, it may be the case that asking for temperature checks or questions about someone's health, that would not be allowable. But in this pandemic situation, since it qualifies as a health, as a health emergency, the actual kind of federal term is escaping me, but basically since it qualifies as a federal emergency, there are ways now that they're providing guidance as some of the things that you would not be able to usually ask as an employer, you are able to ask in the context of this health emergency. And there are very specific, there's a very specific way under federal law that one looks at if something qualifies as a disability for purposes of availing of protections. And it's an opportune time to be talking about that because there's just been the anniversary of the ADA, which is the federal law covering that in the workplaces. I think that just passed this past week. So it's an opportune time to be talking about. Our law is slightly different from the ADA. The New York City Human Rights Law is slightly different from the ADA. So as the EEOC has been providing its guidance, we have actually adopted most of those guidance, but in the areas in which there are differences, we have been putting that out also on our COVID-19 website page, so people should feel free to check that out. And one of those differences is that to make it easier both for employers and employees, one, and two, in order to really embrace how our law is different from the ADA, we've made it clear that COVID-19 is considered a disability under our laws. Some of the questions that come up, in this time of great uncertainty with employers and employees wondering, is this something I could ask for an accommodation for because it's a recognized disability? Yes, you can under our law, because under the City Human Rights Law, we do recognize COVID-19 as a disability. Ergo, you would be able to ask for a reasonable accommodation in employment in order to address your medical issues and still continue employment, things of that nature.
Right.
Just a quick reminder to everyone listening, if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the Q&A box so that it will be there.
Right. I see that there's a follow-up question now to Shantanu's question, and it is, if President Trump were to send federal agents to New York City to control protesting, what can the city do to prevent human rights violations against protesters like we're seeing in Portland? And for example, arbitrary detention, disproportionate use of force, etc.
These are, of course, these are, of course, very challenging questions. And I'm going to go back to some of the comments that I made, at the very beginning, which is, these are kind of issues that we have seen, unfortunately, take place in other countries. We're not here in our country as familiar with having to deal with these types of situations because it is a new experience for us. Because I think we have not seen human rights affected in the way, or liberties affected in the way that we have seen now under this presidential administration. So, I will say it's not really an area that the Commission on Human Rights, I think, would take on. It wouldn't be something necessarily that my agency would be able to take up. One of the issues is that under our law, when we talk about bias-based profiling by law enforcement, it speaks directly to NYPD. So it's not read broadly we wouldn't have jurisdiction, for instance, over federal actors, things of that nature. I think it is, from a human rights perspective, we are living in grave times as we're seeing this. And it's interesting to see the way in which it's playing out in other cities. It is comforting for me to see the way in which cities and localities are resisting this type of excursion and this kind of these gross violations of due process that I think that we're seeing in many situations. And my expectation is that, if something like that were to occur in New York City, given the people here who are, committed to making sure that New York City is a free and a place where people can express dissent and can protest, that there would be many forces here that would be pushing against those types of actions. And certainly, I think that the mayor has been on record as to saying that we would not welcome that into the city.
Thank you. Yes, I believe the mayor in one of his press conferences said that if such a thing were to happen, that the city would immediately take legal action. He didn't specify exactly what he meant by that. Do you know any more about that, or we'll have to hope that it does not come to that kind of situation? I noticed the mayors around the country who signed that letter stating very clearly that they did not want this sort of intervention, where New York wasn't included in that. They were from other cities across, mostly in the Middle West and the West.
Yeah, Chicago, yeah, and other cities, yes.
Seattle and of course places like Kansas City and so on. Anyway, I want to go into one other area that we haven't really covered. And I know you have a background in labor protections and labor law. We, aside from everything else that's going on because of COVID-19, we're facing a terrible crisis of joblessness. And I'm wondering if, how that situation interfaces with human rights.
Sure.
People presumably have a right to be able to sustain themselves in a crisis, especially a crisis of this sort that is just simply beyond our control and no fault of our own. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so interestingly, you've kind of perfectly teed up something that we're going to be releasing very soon. On Thursday, we're actually releasing our newest piece of legal enforcement guidance. And that will be legal enforcement guidance on addressing age discrimination in the workplace. And if you look at the joblessness, if you look at the people who have lost jobs during this pandemic, you're looking disproportionately at older workers, people who are older than 50 and older, and younger workers. So disproportionately also millennials. So if you see, like, if you were to do the pie chart or the bar graph, you would see like the older workers and the younger workers. Those are the folks who have been most affected by the pandemic and losing their jobs. And, our law, so if you look at federal ADEA law, for instance, that very much focuses only on older workers, or what at the time it was codified, what they consider to be older workers, and it's pinned at 40 and older under federal law.
Mm-hmm.
Our city human rights law does not have any sort of age limitation. You can't be discriminated against based on your age. So whether you are an older employer defined, depending on the situation, or you are a younger employee, you could also file claims under our agency. And so one of the reasons that we're thinking it makes sense to be releasing this guidance right now is to really challenge for entities, if you are thinking about restructures, or you're thinking about who you're letting go in this, of course, challenging climate, that you also are challenging yourselves as businesses, employers, entities, that you are not feeding into some of the stereotypes or some of the ways that, again, age discrimination has just been normalized in our community, in our society. It's been so normalized by the media, by kind of off-color jokes, by people just equating age with, frailty, or age with outdatedness, et cetera, et cetera. We, of course, know, again, if you look at research and that's wrong, that older workers and younger workers bring great strengths to different types of workplaces. And so we're releasing the guidance so that people can be actively, affirmatively thinking about the ways, challenging themselves to think about ways in which they are allowing these biases, these stereotypes, to kind of creep into their decision making, whether it is intentionally so or it is, unconsciously so. Because we want people, as we are going through this pandemic, which sadly is continuing, we don't want these two classes of workers to be so affected, because also there are other reasons that make them particularly vulnerable to financial hardship, right? And so that will actually be released on Thursday. It'll be on our website, and I hope people take the opportunity to check it out.
Thank you. I asked you about that. Yeah, so everyone can be alert for the release of that document. And I think this is particularly hard on older women, because they have a very difficult time getting employment after age 50 if they have lost their jobs. And that was before, these studies were done before the COVID crisis.
Right.
I see, do we have time? I know that Commissioner Malalis has to go soon. Do we have time? I have one more question on the screen, is more about Mayor de Blasio.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. And one thing I just want to chime in, because you were mentioning resources on your website. For those who haven't seen in the chat, there have been some excellent resources that have been put in there. And I don't know if the bystander training is one, but that one might be of interest too. So I just wanted to throw that out there before Helena turns to the last question.
I also want to mention, we have so many of our resources, including the ones that are in different languages, included in videos in different languages, etc., included on our website. So please do check it out, because we want people to be able to learn from this, to be able to use this, send it to other jurisdictions. Hopefully some of the things that we can be helpful on gets replicated.
Okay, so, and we'll make this the last one so that you have, you are able to go on to your next meeting. Someone has sent in a question, it's anonymous. Mayor de Blasio has indicated that New York City primary schools will likely try a hybrid model for the start of the new school year. How will the city and schools ensure that all students receive their right to education if so many families have limited access to computers or stable internet? Will this experience lead to a broader discussion about how to address the disparities in education across the city?
I'll just say, I wish I had the answer to that question. I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old, both of whom are in the public school system here in New York City. I think I, like many other parents with children in schools, we are all, trying to think through how we can be supportive of our specific school communities, and also be thoughtful just, more broadly in New York City, to make sure that, again, when at these times of crisis or pandemic, as we've already seen with health disparities, this is where communities of color tend to suffer. And I think in thinking through some of the great challenges to our school system that we're going to be confronting in the fall, we are also, I think there's, whether you are an administration official, or you're a parent, or you're somebody who's just interested in your community, I think everybody right now is very hard at work kind of thinking through what are the ways in which we can provide the education to our children that they need, while also making sure that we are not creating greater disparities as a result of all the other variables and challenges that are at play. I will say, during this past school year, as far as I understand it, all students who needed a laptop, or were able to, or who had requested a laptop, were able to get one of those from DOE. And there's many ways in which DOE and other agencies have been trying to equip schools and communities for this kind of odd new normal that we're all a part of. I think there's a lot more work to be done. I think that our chancellor would say the same thing, and I think that a lot of folks in the city would say the same thing. I don't have an easy answer to that. I wish I did. But certainly I think it's something that we're all going to be working towards, making sure that all of our children have safe access to education and to learning, in the fall, and that we do it in a way that doesn't exacerbate, the inequities, racial and otherwise, that we know exist in our school systems.
Well, actually making laptops available to all children who do not have them is a kind of equalizer. And, there are very few good things that can be said about this virus having stricken us. But since it has, I think if children who would not otherwise have that facility at home acquire it, of course, there's a difference between what we say is going to happen and what actually happens. And then there's a whole question of internet training and for them and their families.
Or even broadband access, right? So it's one thing to have a computer, it's another thing to be able to access the internet if you don't have broadband in your area. And I know very early on, that's something that, this administration was really focused on, was expanding broadband access, particularly communities that did not have it. But certainly for communities where the broadband access is poor, it's one thing to have a computer, but if you really can't use it for the lessons you need to, or to get to your school meetings, there's still limitations, and all of those things really have to get worked out.
And this impacts students even at the university level who have gone home to live with their families and don't have that access. We want to let you go on time. Carmela, thank you so very much. This was absolutely fabulous. We learned so much from you today.
Thank you.
Anytime we get to talk about human rights to the larger community, we're very happy to do it. So Courtney, thank you so much for inviting me. Helena, thank you so much for facilitating this really fun discussion. And again, thank you to all the folks at Network 2020. I also just want to say thank you to Saina, who is part of Network 2020, and I think she was the force that kind of married this, created this discussion. So I just wanted to give her a shout out to her. She's also at the Commission on Human Rights, and she's fantastic. So thank you to her for connecting us.
Yeah, thank you, Helena. Thank you, Commissioner Malalis, and thank you, Sayana. This is wonderful. Just to those still listening, we have a couple of events coming up Thursday. We have Soner Şaftay, who will be talking about Turkey and President Erdogan, and then next Tuesday, you have to go, yes, bye-bye. We will have a discussion about vaccine access, so innovative ideas behind how to create better access to vaccines. And that one will be Tuesday at 10:30. Let me just make sure I have the time correct. Yes, it's August 4th at 10:30 a.m. And then we have Thursday at 11 a.m. this Thursday at 11 a.m. So I hope we see you all there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye, Courtney.
Bye-bye.